The summer heat pressed down on Redemption Gulch, a heavy cloak of dust and oppressive quiet. Inside the Golden Lotus Saloon, a fragile oasis of polished mahogany and the scent of aged spirits, Lynn moved with a practiced grace that belied the tremor in her heart. She was a woman of 25 years, her traditional red cheongsam a vibrant, defiant splash of color against the drab canvas of the frontier, clinging to curves that turned every head, yet her eyes, dark and deep as mountain pools, held a wisdom far beyond her years. Outside, the world was raw and unforgiving, but within these walls she had carved out a fragile existence after her husband's sudden passing, a legacy she guarded with the fierce, quiet determination of a tigress. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of men seeking escape, usually offered a rhythm of comfort, a deceptive sense of normalcy. Tonight, however, an ugly silence had fallen, thick and palpable, as the heavy bootsteps of 4 men crossed her threshold. They were the kind of men who wore their cruelty like a badge, faces etched with hard living and harder intentions. Big Red, the tallest of them, his beard a matted firestorm, slammed a fist onto the bar, rattling the bottles. "Whiskey, little lady," he rasped, his voice a gravelly growl that scraped against Lynn's composure. "And make it free." His eyes, mean and bloodshot, raked over her, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Lynn kept her hands steady as she wiped down the counter, her movements precise. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Nothing is free in the Golden Lotus," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying a surprising steel that cut through the oppressive quiet. A ripple of unease went through the few patrons scattered around the room, their gazes dropping to their drinks, preferring to be invisible. The oppressive weight of their fear settled heavy in the air, a silent judgment that she was alone in this. She felt the prickle of sweat on her temples, not from the heat, but from the raw, unvarnished threat that emanated from Big Red and his companions. Her chin lifted imperceptibly, a small, private act of defiance that no one else in the room seemed to notice, or perhaps dared to acknowledge. The world outside the saloon doors was unforgiving, and within, she knew, some men sought to make it even more so. She remembered her husband's hands, strong and calloused, as he taught her to count coins, to measure ounces, to stand firm. He had built this place, a dream of theirs, and she would not let it crumble into dust at the whim of common thieves. The fading light of the afternoon sun, filtering through the grimy windows, cast long, distorted shadows of the outlaws across the worn floorboards, making them seem even more monstrous. The air grew thick, not just with dust, but with unspoken challenge, and Lynn, standing alone behind the polished bar, became the immovable point in a shifting, dangerous landscape. The outlaws, accustomed to easy intimidation, simply laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that grated on Lynn's nerves. "You hear that, boys?" Big Red sneered, turning to his companions, their faces mirroring his malicious amusement. "The little China doll thinks she can charge us." One of them, a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, nudged another, a glint of cruel anticipation in his eyes. Lynn watched them, her mind racing, 1,000 possibilities of resistance and surrender flashing through her thoughts. She thought of the long journey across the ocean, the harsh beauty of the land, and the endless days she and her husband had poured into building this place, brick by painstaking brick, dream by resilient dream. She remembered the warmth of his hand in hers, the shared laughter over a perfectly mixed drink, the quiet satisfaction of seeing their saloon thrive. This place was more than just a business. It was the last tangible piece of him, a testament to their love and their struggle. Her gaze swept over the bottles, each one a silent guardian of her livelihood, her independence. The town itself had offered little in the way of true support, their curiosity in whispers often louder than any offers of assistance, especially since her husband's passing. They came to drink, to forget, but rarely to protect. She was an outsider, always, and that isolation, while often lonely, also forged a core of unbreakable self-reliance within her. She moved, slow and deliberate, reaching for a glass, and then another, placing them on the bar with a soft clink. "The price is 2 bits a shot," she stated, her voice steady, refusing to waver, though her palms were slick with a cold sweat that no amount of summer heat could explain. Her eyes, however, caught the fleeting glance of Jake, a quiet rancher who often sat in the corner, nursing a single beer for hours. He was a man of few words, his face weathered like old leather. His eyes, when they met hers, held a depth she couldn't quite decipher. Tonight he had stopped swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on Big Red, a silent, almost imperceptible tension in his broad shoulders. It was not an offer of help, not yet, but a watchfulness, a silent acknowledgment that she was not entirely unseen. She drew a small measure of strength from that fleeting connection, a whisper of solidarity in a world that often felt utterly indifferent. The silence stretched again, taut as a fiddle string, before Big Red's heavy boot scraped across the floor, and he took a step closer, leaning over the bar, his face inches from hers, reeking of stale whiskey and unwashed days. "I said it's free, little flower. Or do you want to see what happens when we take what we want?" His voice was low, menacing, a venomous promise. Lynn's breath hitched, but she held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The air in the Golden Lotus thickened, not just with the scent of cheap tobacco and fear, but with a palpable sense of impending violence. Lynn felt the oppressive weight of Big Red's proximity, his breath hot and stale against her face. She could hear the murmur of the other patrons, a rustle of discomfort, but no one moved, no one dared to intervene. They were shadows, witnesses frozen in their own self-preservation, and she was acutely aware of her solitude. Her fingers, despite her best efforts, trembled slightly as she picked up a clean rag, her gaze sweeping over the polished wood of the bar, a silent plea for strength from the very planks that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell, tales of dragons and phoenixes, of quiet strength enduring against insurmountable odds. It was a faint comfort, a whisper from a distant land, but it grounded her. "You will pay for your drink just like everyone else," Lynn said, her voice still quiet but now imbued with a fragile authority that surprised even herself. It was not a challenge born of bravado, but of desperation, of a refusal to be broken. Big Red's laughter boomed, a cruel sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the saloon. "Everyone else, huh?" he scoffed, his eyes narrowing to slits. "I don't see anyone else trying to stop us, little bird. This is our house now." He gestured around the room, his gaze sweeping over the cowering patrons, his power asserted through their fear. Scarface, one of his companions, reached out, his hand grasping a bottle of expensive rye, his intention clear. Lynn's eyes flashed, a spark of pure, unadulterated anger flaring within her. This was her legacy, her husband's dream, and they were defiling it. "Put that down," she commanded, her voice rising slightly, the soft cadence of her native tongue giving way to a sharper, more assertive tone. It was a risky move, a direct confrontation that could easily ignite the volatile situation. Jake, in the corner, shifted. The creak of his chair was barely audible, yet it cut through the tense silence, a tiny interruption that made Big Red pause, his attention momentarily diverted. Lynn felt a flicker of hope, a fragile thread woven into the fabric of fear, but it was quickly extinguished as Big Red turned back to her, his grin widening, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Feisty, aren't we?" he drawled, his hand reaching for her, not to strike, but to grab, to assert his dominance in a different, more insidious way. Her heart leaped into her throat, a cold dread washing over her. This was the moment she had feared, the line about to be crossed, and she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long, bruised shadows that stretched across the floor, mirroring the bruise forming in her soul. Lynn recoiled instinctively, her hand flying up to swat away Big Red's grasping fingers. The sharp crack of her palm against his wrist echoed through the stunned silence of the saloon, a sound disproportionately loud in the tense atmosphere. For a split second, a flicker of surprise, then pure rage, contorted Big Red's face. His eyes, usually a dull, malevolent red, now blazed with a dangerous fire. Scarface, seeing his leader challenged, lunged forward, but Big Red, with a snarl, raised a hand to stop him, his gaze never leaving Lynn. His pride had been wounded, and he preferred to deal with the affront personally. Lynn's breath hitched, her chest tight with a fear so profound it tasted like copper in her mouth, yet a strange, almost exhilarating defiance coursed through her veins. She had struck a beast, and now she awaited its inevitable retaliation. The small domestic details of the saloon, the polished wood, the neatly arranged bottles, suddenly felt like flimsy shields against the raw, animalistic fury she faced. She thought of her husband, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in her. He had taught her to face adversity with dignity, to never surrender her spirit, no matter the cost. His memory was a warm ember in the cold grip of her fear, a source of courage she drew upon now. Jake, in his corner, had not moved, but the air around him seemed to hum with a coiled energy, a silent observer whose presence, however passive, was beginning to feel like a subtle pressure. Lynn knew she couldn't rely on him, or anyone else, not truly. This fight, in its essence, was hers alone. "You think you can just lay your hands on me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, but still carrying the weight of her indignation. It was not a question, but an accusation, a drawing of a line in the dust. Big Red laughed again, a low, menacing rumble that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. "I think I can do whatever I want," he retorted, his voice dripping with condescension. "And there ain't a soul in this God-forsaken town who'll stop me." He took another step forward, closing the distance, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. The other outlaws, sensing the shift in the tide, began to spread out, effectively cornering her behind the bar. The few remaining patrons, eyes wide with terror, remained motionless, paralyzed by fear, their helplessness a heavy burden on Lynn's already strained spirit. The saloon, once a place of refuge and livelihood, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in around her. The summer air, thick and humid, suddenly seemed to press down on her, stealing the breath from her lungs. She looked at Big Red's face, etched with a cruel satisfaction, and understood, with a chilling clarity, that she stood on the precipice of losing everything. It was in that moment, a desperate, terrifying clarity, that a thought, cold and precise, began to form in her mind, a plan born of quiet fury and an unyielding will to survive. A hush descended upon the Golden Lotus, heavy and pregnant with anticipation. Big Red, towering over Lynn, his hands still tingling from her unexpected defiance, watched her with a mixture of amusement and growing menace. His men, positioned strategically, ensured there was no easy escape. Lynn felt the weight of their combined gazes, a suffocating blanket of predatory intent. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs, now settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, a strange calm descending upon her. She looked past Big Red, past his sneering companions, and her eyes landed on a particular bottle, nestled amidst the others on the top shelf behind the bar. It was a slender, elegant flask, stoppered with a wax seal, its amber contents shimmering dully in the fading light. This was no ordinary whiskey. This was her husband's private stock, a special blend he had crafted himself, reserved for celebrations, for moments of rare joy. It was a potent symbol, a relic of a happier time, and now, in this moment of crisis, it held a different, darker purpose. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of dust and fear mingling with the familiar aroma of aged wood and spirits. Her mind raced, sifting through options, discarding them one by one until only this desperate, daring plan remained. "You want free whiskey?" Lynn finally said, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor of pure adrenaline ran through her veins. "You shall have it." Big Red's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise cutting through his cruel bravado. He hadn't expected her to capitulate so easily. A sneer of triumph began to spread across his face. "That's more like it, little lady," he grunted, taking another step closer, ready to claim his prize. Lynn, however, didn't move. She met his gaze, and for the first time there was a glint in her dark eyes that was not fear, but something far more dangerous. It was a quiet fire, a resolute purpose that sent a shiver, barely perceptible, down Big Red's spine. The heat of the summer evening pressed in, making the air thick and still, as if the very world held its breath. She reached up, her fingers slender and graceful, and retrieved the special bottle. Its coolness against her fingertips felt like a promise, a secret held tight. The label, hand-painted by her husband, depicted a soaring phoenix, a symbol of rebirth and resilience. She held it aloft for a moment, letting the flickering lamplight catch its sheen, a dramatic, almost theatrical gesture that captivated the outlaw's attention. "This isn't just any whiskey," she announced, her voice gaining a surprising resonance that commanded the room. "This is special. On the house." The last words hung in the air, a silent challenge, a chilling invitation. The outlaws exchanged puzzled glances, their predatory glee momentarily replaced by a vague uneasiness. Jake, in his corner, finally pushed himself to his feet, a silent sentinel whose presence, for the first time, felt like more than mere observation. Lynn smiled then, a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that promised more than it revealed. It was the smile of a woman who had made a choice, a sacrifice, and knew, with absolute certainty, that she would see it through. Lynn's hand, surprisingly steady, uncorked the special bottle with a soft pop that seemed to reverberate through the hushed saloon. She poured the dark, viscous liquid into 4 pristine shot glasses, the amber fluid catching the dim lamplight, swirling with a rich, almost oily sheen. Big Red and his men watched her, their initial surprise giving way to a mixture of greedy anticipation and a lingering, vague suspicion. Scarface eyed the bottle, then Lynn, a frown creasing his scarred brow. "What's so special about it, little lady?" he grunted, his voice a low growl of distrust. Lynn offered another small, enigmatic smile, the kind that held secrets close. "It is a rare blend," she explained, her voice a calm counterpoint to the tempest brewing within her. "Made by my husband, for special occasions. He believed it brought clarity, a true understanding of one's path." Her gaze flickered over Big Red, then to each of his companions, a silent challenge in her dark eyes. "Drink up, gentlemen. It's on the house." The invitation, edged with a dangerous undertone, seemed to compel them. Big Red, always the first to assert dominance, snatched a glass, his eyes still locked on Lynn's, as if trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind her composed demeanor. The other 3 followed suit, their hands less confident than their leaders, but the allure of free, special whiskey was too strong to resist. The first gulps were swift, almost eager. Lynn watched, her breath held tight in her chest, the scent of the potent concoction now mingling with the heavy summer air. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her, but she held herself rigid, her composure a fragile shield. Jake, in the corner, remained on his feet, his gaze piercing, not just at the outlaws, but at Lynn, a silent question in his deep-set eyes that she could not, dared not, answer. He saw the shift in her posture, the heightened tension in her shoulders, the subtle tightening around her mouth, and a quiet alarm began to prickle at him. The saloon's oppressive heat seemed to intensify, wrapping around them, a suffocating blanket. Big Red slammed his empty glass onto the bar. "Bah! Tastes like—" He stopped, a strange look of confusion crossing his face. His eyes, which had been so sharp with malice, seemed to unfocus for a moment, then struggled to regain their fierce glint. One of his companions swayed, clutching the bar, a low groan escaping his lips. "My head, it's spinning," he slurred, his words thick and indistinct. Lynn watched them, a cold dread warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. The silence that followed Big Red's half-finished complaint was absolute, punctuated only by the shallow, ragged breaths of the outlaws, their faces now pale, their expressions slackening into bewildered stupor. The warmth of the summer evening suddenly felt distant, a memory from a different world as the chill of her desperate gamble settled in Lynn's bones. The effects of the special whiskey spread through the outlaws like a creeping paralysis, a slow, insidious poison that robbed them of their menace. Scarface was the next to falter, his hand dropping from the bar, sending his empty glass clattering to the floor with a sharp, shattering sound that echoed through the silence. He slumped against the counter, his head lolling, eyes half closed, a bewildered gurgle escaping his lips. The other two, their bravado completely evaporated, sank slowly to their knees, their limbs rubbery, their movements uncoordinated and clumsy. Big Red, despite his initial resilience, was beginning to succumb. He blinked slowly, his eyes trying to focus on Lynn, but his gaze kept sliding away, unfixed. His once menacing sneer had dissolved into a slack-jawed stupor, his body swaying precariously. Lynn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, watched them fall, one by one, into a deep, drug-induced sleep. The saloon, which moments before had vibrated with tension, now felt eerily still, filled only with the heavy, uneven breathing of the incapacitated men. A wave of nausea washed over her, a delayed reaction to the sheer terror she had endured, and the desperate lengths she had gone to survive. This was not the violence of bullets or fists, but a quiet, calculated act of self-preservation, born of a deep-seated fear and an even deeper well of resilience. She felt the chill of moral ambiguity settle upon her, a heavy cloak that contrasted sharply with the summer heat outside. Had she done right? Had there been another way? The questions gnawed at her, even as relief, stark and raw, began to flood her system. The few remaining patrons who had been frozen in their seats slowly began to stir, their gazes moving from the unconscious outlaws to Lynn, their expressions a mixture of shock, awe, and a cautious, dawning respect. One man, a grizzled prospector named Silas, slowly pushed himself from his chair, his eyes wide. What was in that, little lady?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Lynn did not answer immediately. She simply stood behind the bar, her hands gripping the polished wood, her knuckles white. She looked at the faces of the patrons, faces that had always held a detached curiosity, now filled with a bewildered understanding of the quiet strength she possessed. Jake, moving with a silent grace, was already by the saloon doors, securing the latch, his gaze unwavering as he watched her. His presence was no longer a question, but a quiet, reassuring anchor in the suddenly calm storm. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not judgment, but a deep, somber comprehension, and perhaps a touch of admiration. The summer evening, having dipped below the horizon, now cast the saloon in deepening twilight, the shadows long and soft, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of the day. With the outlaws utterly incapacitated, slumped in various stages of unconsciousness, the oppressive silence in the Golden Lotus began to break, replaced by a low hum of hushed whispers among the remaining patrons. Lynn felt the last vestiges of adrenaline drain from her body, leaving her bone-weary and trembling, but alive. Her hands, which had gripped the bar with such intensity, now slid away, feeling oddly disconnected. She looked at the fallen men, their heavy forms sprawled awkwardly, and a profound weariness settled over her. This was not a victory to be celebrated with raucous cheers, but a grim, necessary act etched onto her soul. Jake, moving with purpose, crossed the room and gently took the special bottle from her hand, placing it back on the shelf with a quiet click. Their fingers brushed, a brief, electrifying contact that sent a jolt through Lynn, a sudden awareness of his solid presence in the chaos. He didn't speak, but his eyes, deep and knowing, conveyed a silent understanding that bypassed words. "They need to be removed," Silas the prospector said, his voice still hushed, but now filled with a new resolve. Others nodded, a collective sense of duty emerging from their initial paralysis. The community, however flawed, was beginning to coalesce, roused by Lynn's quiet defiance. Lynn herself felt a strange mix of relief and lingering dread. The immediate danger was past, but the consequences, the questions, the quiet judgments were still to come. She thought of her husband, his steady hand, his comforting presence. He would have known what to do, how to navigate the aftermath. But he was gone, and she was left to forge her own path, alone. Yet now, perhaps, not entirely so. Jake, without a word, began to drag the heaviest of the outlaws, Big Red, towards the back door. It was a laborious task, but he moved with a quiet determination that spoke volumes. One by one, the other patrons, emboldened by Jake's actions and Lynn's unwavering presence, began to help, carefully but firmly moving the unconscious men out into the cool night air. The saloon was slowly being reclaimed, cleansed of their toxic presence. Lynn watched, a silent observer of this unexpected solidarity, a fragile thread of connection weaving itself through the hardened fabric of the frontier town. The summer night had fully descended, bringing with it a subtle coolness that was a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the day. A few stars had begun to prickle through the darkening sky, distant and serene, a silent witness to the quiet drama that had unfolded within the Golden Lotus. The emptiness of the saloon, once filled with menace, now held a profound quiet, a sense of having weathered a storm, leaving behind a scarred but resilient landscape. The news of what transpired at the Golden Lotus spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones over morning coffee, and shouted in surprised exclamations across dusty Main Street. The outlaws, still deeply incapacitated, were eventually discovered by the local sheriff, a slow-moving but ultimately fair man named Miller. He'd taken them away, their ignominious departure a stark contrast to their earlier swagger. Lynn spent the following days in a haze of exhaustion and emotional vulnerability. The relief was immense, a heavy burden lifted, but the memory of the fear, the desperation, and the drastic choice she had made lingered like a phantom ache. She cleaned the saloon with a renewed intensity, polishing every surface until it gleamed, a physical act of purification, of reclaiming her space. The patrons who returned were different. Their curiosity had been replaced by a quiet deference, their wary distance by a newfound respect. They bought their drinks, paid their dues, and spoke in low, respectful tones, the air in the Golden Lotus now imbued with a fragile sense of safety and earned dignity. Jake, however, was a constant. He appeared each evening, not to drink heavily, but to sit in his usual corner, a silent sentinel. He would sometimes offer a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, or simply meet her gaze across the room, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that needed no words. One evening, as the last of the customers were leaving, and the summer twilight painted the sky in bruised hues of orange and purple, he approached the bar. "That was a hell of a choice, Lynn," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the most he had spoken to her in weeks. She met his gaze, a vulnerability she hadn't realized she still possessed reflected in her dark eyes. "It was the only choice I had left," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, the raw truth of it hanging in the air between them. He nodded slowly, his weathered face etched with a quiet empathy. "Some choices, they mark you, but they also show what you're made of." He didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts, just a grounded, earnest acknowledgment of her strength, her pain. It was a balm to her weary soul, a gentle hand reaching across the chasm of her solitude. The slow burn romance was not in grand gestures or impassioned declarations, but in these quiet moments of shared understanding, in the unspoken promise of a watchful presence. The summer nights grew longer, filled with the distant sounds of coyotes and the gentle hum of cicadas, and within the Golden Lotus a different kind of quiet settled, one not born of fear, but of a hard-won peace. Months bled into a new season, the vibrant heat of summer giving way to the crisp, clear air of autumn, then the hushed reverence of winter, and finally the tender promise of spring. The Golden Lotus Saloon had transformed, not just in its physical space, which Lynn continued to maintain with meticulous care, but in its very spirit. It was no longer merely a place for men to drown their sorrows or seek fleeting pleasure. It had become a sanctuary, a quiet testament to resilience, a beacon of earned dignity in a harsh land. Lynn herself had changed. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet strength that was palpable, a deep inner peace hard-won through fire. The memory of Big Red and his men remained, a scar on her soul, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it served as a reminder of her capacity to endure, to protect what was hers, and to stand firm against injustice. The special bottle, though empty, remained on the top shelf, a silent symbol of the lengths she had gone to, and the power of a woman pushed to her limits. Jake was no longer just a regular customer. He was a steadfast companion, his presence a comforting, unwavering anchor in her life. Their romance had blossomed in the quietest of ways, through shared glances across a crowded room, through the silent understanding of difficult days, and through the unspoken promises held in a touch of hands over the polished bar. He never pressured her, never demanded, simply existed, a strong, gentle presence that allowed her to slowly, tentatively open her heart again. They often sat together after the last patron had left, the saloon bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, simply existing in comfortable silence, or sharing quiet stories of their lives, their dreams. The town, too, had shifted in its perception of her. She was no longer just the Chinese widow, but Lynn, the proprietor of the Golden Lotus, a woman of formidable strength and unwavering character. Respect had replaced curiosity, and gratitude had overcome indifference. The community, once passive, now held a quiet, collective pride in her resilience. One brisk spring evening, as the first delicate blossoms scented the air, Lynn stood by the window, looking out at the gentle rain falling on Redemption Gulch. The sounds of the saloon behind her were soft, familiar. Jake was at the bar, polishing a glass, his movements sure and rhythmic. She felt a profound sense of belonging, a quiet triumph that wasn't about wealth or power, but about survival, love, and the strength of the human spirit. The light filtering through the window caught the faint shimmer of a small, polished wooden bird on the shelf, a gift from Jake, a symbol of freedom and hope. She turned, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt truly, completely at peace. The Golden Lotus, her legacy, her home, now held a warmth that transcended the summer heat, a warmth built on sacrifice, dignity, and a love that had quietly, steadfastly, bloomed in the most unexpected of places.